Modern Chess Instructor, W. Steinitz, Part I, containing elementary explanations for beginners, the description of notations, a telegraphic chess code, an essay on the principles of the game, and analyses of 6 popular openings, with illustrative games to each opening, etc., etc., etc. The appendix contains the games of the contest between Messrs. Steinitz and Chigarin, played at Havana in January and February I-889, with annotations by the author. G.P. Putnam's Sons, New York, London. 29 West 23D Street, 27 King William St. Strand. L889. Copyright by W. Steinitz. 1889. All rights reserved. Entered at Stationers' Hall, London, by W. Steinitz. To the generous patron of chess and chess masters, the Honourable R. Steele of Calcutta, Member of the Executive Council of His Excellency the Viceroy of India, the whole work on chess, of which the present is the first volume, is dedicated, with the most sincere sentiments of the highest esteem and warmest friendship, by the author. Chapter V. Relative Value of Pieces and Principles of Play. One of the most important exigencies in the conduct of the game is the exercise of the most critical judgment in estimating the relative value of the pawns and pieces, which must be strongly taken into consideration in effecting exchanges, as well as in the formulation of general principles for the guidance of play in all parts of the game. But owing to the endless number and variety of combinations that are possible over the board, it has been found impossible to give more than an approximate theoretical and practical comparison of the relative powers of the men. In Staunton's Handbook, page 34, it is stated that some scientists have calculated the approximate mathematical value to be as follows. Taking the pawn as the unit, the knight is worth 3.05, the bishop 3.50, the rook 5.48, and the queen 9.94. On this basis, which in the main is in accordance with our own experience and observations, we shall proceed to indicate, in connection with the above approximate valuation, some of the most important general principles of regulating the actions of the men, which we believe are now mostly accepted by the strongest masters of the day, and the knowledge of which very often enables the player to dispense with analysis, or at any rate greatly assists his calculations. As, however, already explained in our preface, the scope of this work will not enable us to illustrate the application of our guiding maxims any further than is done in our notes to our analysis and selected games. We shall now endeavor to describe seriatim and briefly the powers of each man, and its most favorable mode of development, as well as to offer some hints as far as practicable about its value and action in the middle game and in the ending. The king is considered invaluable, according to all authorities, on account of his not being liable to capture or exchange, which also involves the complication of his having to move out of check, or to cover the same, or to capture a checking man, to the risks of relative value of pieces and principles of play, exclusion of the choice of other moves. Baron von Hakelbrand in Builder's Planbook G very properly describes the power of the king for the pawn ending as stronger than any minor piece, namely, a knight or a bishop. We are inclined to extend this valuation to all parts of the game, and we would add that the action of the king combined with one defended pawn is about equal to that of a rook, provided that neither the adverse king nor any other hostile man can cooperate with the latter. We agree in the main with the authorities who recommend that the king should as a rule castle early on the king's side, but this refuge of the king is sometimes fraught with danger when one of the pawns on the king's wing, more especially the KKTP or KRP, have been previously moved or may soon be compelled to advance. Likewise, when the opponent has obtained the majority of pawns on the queen's side, it is generally better not to widen the distance between the king and the adverse majority, as the king is a powerful piece in the ending for stopping the hostile pawns. In either of these cases, it is desirable to aim first at an exchange of queens and some minor pieces, and to postpone castling or not to castle at all. The king is sometimes brought into play at Q2 after developing the minor pieces on the queen's side, or at KB2 after the advance of the KBP. Castling on the queen's side is not often advantageous, for it leaves the QRP undefended, as the handbook rightly points out. The notable exceptions are when the queen's file has been opened for the player who castles on the queen's side, while the adversary cannot open that file, or when the pawns on the king's side can be advanced for a strong attack with the cooperation of other pieces against the adverse king who has castled on the other side. In castling on either side, it should be remembered that the RP, KTP and BP on that wing in conjunction with a minor piece, generally a B or a KT at 63 or at BSQ, after removing respectively the KRKSQ or KBSQ, form an excellent protection against the larger majority of attacks that can be planned by the opponent. The advance of either of these pawns should therefore be postponed as long as possible, or else it will form an easier mark for the attack of the hostile men, and one of the minor pieces should be kept within convenient reach of 63 or BSQ on the side on which the king has castled. Excepting some openings that will be specially treated in this work, it is rarely good play to move the king in the early part of the game. But this may be resorted to even with advantage in some cases when the opponent allows his KP to be taken with a KT in order to gain the KBP for it. For instance, after the moves IPK4, IPK4, 2B, 64, 2KKT 63, 3QKT63, black, though the second player may now safely reply 3. KTXP and allow his king to be disconcerted for a little while by the answer 4BXPCH, for after 4KXB. 5KTXKT, 5PQ4, 6QB3CH, 6KKTSQ, 7KTKT, 5, 7QQZ. The attack will be soon transferred to black, who has gained the advantage of the strong combination of two bishops and the formation of an excellent center. Some other analogous cases arise sometimes in the opening and may be treated in a similar manner. Occasionally it becomes necessary in the middle game, either for purposes of attack or defense, to remove the king from one side to the other, and sometimes by way of squares in the middle of the board. Such a movement ought only to be adopted with the greatest precautions, for it generally involves the loss of costly material, especially when queens are not yet exchanged. But on the other hand, the strong defensive powers of the king ought to be fearlessly estimated, and when no such loss is threatened or the opponent cannot bring sufficient pieces up for the attack, it should be remembered that it requires a combination of great powers to make the king. For instance, when he stands on any of the border squares and is not blocked by any of his own men, he can only be mitted by forces that are rarely available for such a purpose in the middle game. A single piece will often cover his retreat, or at least delay mating operations even against relative value OK pieces, and principles of play XXXV, Q and R combined. And when the king travels in the middle of the board without being obstructed in his movements by his own forces, it requires at least the combined strength of queen, rook or a minor piece, and one pawn, which moreover must be in a special favorable position for the purpose, in order to effect mate. Staunton justly warns against giving useless checks, but recommends as generally good play to give a check early in the game, when by so doing the adverse king can be compelled to move and thus be deprived of the right of castling. The same authority also says, do not in all cases take an enemy's pawn that stands before your king. It may sometimes serve as a protection to him. In the ending, the king is a powerful piece for assisting his own pawns or stopping the adverse pawns. In trying to stop an adverse passed pawn that cannot be supported by his own king, it must be observed that the king must stand or be able to move to any square of a quadrate that can be formed by taking as a measure of one line the number of squares from the one inclusive on which the pawn stands up to that of the top row inclusive. Thus, for instance, if white's pawn stands at QR3, the 4 points of the quadrate are the squares at QR, QR8, KB8, and KB3, or respectively for black, QR6, QRSQ, KBSQ, and KB6. If black's king stands on any square from KBSQ up to KB6, and therefore at the greatest distance between the position of the pawn and any square of the quadrate, he will still catch the pawn even if the latter has the move. To give another illustration, we assume that white's pawn stands at QR, and in that case black will be able to stop the p if he stands or can reach any square from QSQ to Q4. But it should be noticed that if white's pawn stands on its original square at QR2, the black king standing on the furthest file of the quadrate, namely on any square from KKTSQ to KKT inclusive, must have the move in order to stop the pawn, as the latter can move 2 squares at starting. Likewise, in any original position of the pawn, the adverse king, if standing on any square of his youth row without at once being able to capture the pawn, must have the first move, even if he is within the quadrate, in order to stop the pawn. But unless the king stands on the file in front of the pawn, the latter can never be stopped if there are more than 4 squares in any straight direction between the king and the pawn. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board, and for that reason should not be subjected to attacks from inferior hostile men by being brought out early in the game. As the handbook G points out, it is dangerous, especially in the opening, to place the queen on the same file or diagonal as the king. Before the game is well developed, 3 pieces including the rook or 2 rooks may be given up for the queen with advantage, but when the adverse position is well defended and the pieces can be brought into cooperation, 3 pieces including 1 rook or 2 rooks are superior to the queen. 2 knights and 1 bishop are generally inferior to the queen. The most favorable points of development for the queen were Q2 after developing the QB or QB2, as well as QKT3 after moving PQB3. The latter development is especially attacking in forms of openings where the KB is played to QB4. It is rarely good to play QK2 or KB3 in the opening, but such posts may sometimes be selected without disadvantage when the adversary has already played PQB3 or is otherwise prevented from bringing out his QKT-QB3, whence the queen would soon be attacked by KTQ5. In some of the close games, the queen may be developed at QR4 after moving the QBP in order to post the KR at QSQ and the QR at QBSQ after developing all the minor pieces. In openings in which the Q piece advanced to Q4, the attack is often formed against the adverse king's side by placing the Q at Q3 after having maneuvered the KB on the same diagonal at QB2 or QKTSQ. Another favorable post for the queen in attacking the king's side is at KKT3, and in some cases like the relative value of pieces and principles of play. The counter-attack in the Evans Gambit declined, or the new attack adopted by the author against the French defense, the queen may advantageously be brought out at KKT4 for an early attack. Yet a player should always be very cautious before capturing a hostile pawn or even a piece with his queen, as situations often arise in which the queen can be afterward blocked out and ultimately caught for inadequate material, or at any rate her return into her own camp is thus delayed until the opponent has gained time for instituting a formidable attack. The rook. Owing to the original position of this piece, which is blocked up by its own men, and the nature of its movements, it cannot be made much use of in the early part of the game. The KR is in many respects superior to the other for opening engagements on account of the earlier facilities for castling on the king's side. The 2 minor pieces on the king's wing can be sooner developed into attacking or commanding positions in most open games, whereas on the other side, the queen has to be brought out in addition to the 2 minor pieces, which in their early development do not threaten much and leave the opponent the option of many more replies. In the majority of openings commencing with IPK4, the castling on the king's side also offers the first opportunities for opening a file for the rook by advancing PKB4, and this is of the utmost importance for that piece, which can only be brought into action on open files or rows. It should be noticed that the 2 combined rooks are in the most favorable position for attack and defense when doubled on an open file. One of the most powerful attacking posts for 1 rook and still more for the 2 combined rooks is on the 7th row, for usually some of the pawns of the adversary are stationed on their original squares and are thus more liable to capture. Such a situation of rooks also often FPRMs an irresistible attack against the adverse king, which is usually confined on the front row. Other common ways of leading the rooks for an attack against the king's side is to bring one of them by way of KB3 to KR3 after the advance of PKB4 and after the exchange or dislodgement of the adverse QB, and then the other rook in a similar manner to KKT3. Such an attack, if well supported by minor pieces or the queen, is often most formidable, but nevertheless its prospect of success must be well weighed, for if the attack fails, the heavier pieces remain uselessly packed together on the king's side, and the opponent has the better chance of winning if he can in the meanwhile form an attack with his pawns in the center or on the queen's wing. 2 cooperating rooks are stronger than the queen when all points are well defended, but more especially when the king is well guarded against harassing checks. But it should be remembered that the rooks are rather clumsy pieces to handle, while the agility and long range of the queen in all directions afford for the latter many opportunities for defense and attack, especially in conjunction with 1 or more minor pieces. The handbook remarks that the rooks are most fitted for supporting the advance of passed pawns, but much less strong for stopping them, whereas queens and bishops are powerful pieces for checking the pawns. It is therefore advisable for the party that has strong pawns to exchange queens and bishops and to retain the rooks, while the contrary policy should be adopted for the defense. The rook is generally slightly stronger than a knight and 2 pawns, while a bishop and 2 pawns are in practical play a shade stronger than the rook. A rook and 2 pawns are superior to 2 knights and a little better than knight and bishop, but about equal with 2 bishops. 2 rooks are a little stronger than 2 knights and a bishop, but slightly inferior to 2 bishops and a knight. In all cases, however, a great deal depends on various considerations that have also to be borne in mind when a minor piece is given up for pawns, namely, the position of pawns, and whether their majority is compact on one wing or divided, whether the king can support his pawns or whether the adversary's king is nigh. Relative value of pieces and principles of play, enough to stop them, whether or not one or more passed pawns can be formed, and whether there are other pawns on the board that are liable to capture or are well defended. It also must not be lost sight of that the party having the pawns, and provided there are no other pawns on the board, or all others can be exchanged, has the only chance of winning, whereas the party thus fighting against the pawns can only play for a draw. In the ending, when trying to advance one or more passed pawns without the king and against the adverse rook alone, it is generally best to place the rook behind the pawns in order not to obstruct their advance. But when fighting against hostile pawns, it is mostly advisable to attack them in the rear or to stop the one furthest advanced in the same manner. 2 passed pawns on adjoining rows will win against the rook with or without the move when they have both reached the 6th square of their file, provided that the adverse king is at least at a distance of 3 clear squares from the pawn next to him, and that neither pawn can be taken by the rook at once. In a similar manner, 3 adjoining passed pawns on the 5th squares of their file will win against the rook with or without the move if the adverse king is at a distance of at least 4 clear squares, and provided that neither pawn can be taken at once by the rook. But it is necessary to know that if the rook attacks any of the pawns excepting the middle one of the 3, the pawn thus attacked should be given up and one of the others should be pushed, when the remaining 2 will secure reaching the 6th square before the adverse king comes up. If, however, the rook attack the middle pawn, that pawn must be first advanced. The bishop. The relative value of this piece has given rise to different opinions among masters and authorities. Some have shown or expressed a distinct preference for the knight in the ending, and it has also been asserted that in conjunction with queen and rook, the knight is stronger than the bishop. But after careful consideration of the average of positions that have attracted our attention and the few exceptions positive lie in favor of either piece, we have come to the conclusion that the power of the bishop corresponds for practical purposes with its estimated superior mathematical value over the knight in the opening and in the middle part as well as in the ending and in the majority of combinations with other forces. The great power of the bishop, especially in conjunction with the other bishop for attack in all directions as well as for the defense, has been first systematically and consistently demonstrated in practice over the board by the great German master Louis Paulsen, who may be regarded in many respects as one of the chief pioneers of the modern school. In the opening, the KB is preferable to the other on account of his usual aggressive bearing against the hostile king's side. His best post in the development of open games is at QB4, whence he is often retreated to Q3 or QB2 after advancing PQ4 and PQB3 if the opponent has castled on the king's side. In some openings in which the adversary is enabled to bring his KTK4, or in close games, or when the opponent threatens or attack on the king's side by bringing his pieces or pawns to bear against the KKT5 square, the KB is sometimes better posted at KZ in order to avoid its being exchanged for a knight or for other defensive purposes. The QB is mostly developed at Q2 or K3, but in some openings he can be kept at home for a long time until PKB4 can be played with advantage, and in case the adversary capture that P with the KP, an excellent game will often be obtained by retaking with the bishop. As already stated, it is often useful to keep the respective bishop within reach of the BSQ on the side on which the king has castled. It is usually best to keep both bishops in communication with both wings, and for that reason as well as on account of the superior value of the bishop, it is very rarely of advantage to pin an adverse knight. Notably, should the pinning of the hostile KKT by QB KKT5 be avoided excepting when some clear advantage or compensation, the relative value of pieces and principles of play can be perceived. For the opponent, by attacking the bishop with PKR3 will either effect an exchange more favorable to himself, or the bishop will have to retreat with great loss of time. It is generally disadvantageous to allow the QB to be driven back to KKT3 out of communication with the other wing, especially when his knight is posted at KB3. For defensive purposes it is generally advisable to retain the bishop of the color on which the majority of pawns are placed or likely to be fixed, more especially when such pawns are stationed on different separated diagonals. For the attack, the bishop should be retained of that color on which the majority of the adverse pawns are placed, and an advantage will then generally be effected by endeavoring to break through with well-supported pawns. The superiority of the bishop over the knight is also shown by the fact that the former, when placed on any square of the board, will command at least 7 squares of one or more clear diagonals. In the middle of the board at k4, k5, q4 or q5, he will command 13 squares. On the other hand, the action of the knight may be reduced to the command of no more than 2 squares if he be placed into any of the 4 corners of the board, and the maximum of squares which he can command is 8. The great power of the two bishops combined has already been alluded to. They are a little superior to bishop and knight and considerably stronger than two knights. With the qualifications mentioned in our description of the properties of the rook, where we have also given some comparative valuations of bishop and rook with pawns on either side, we would further compute that 2 bishops and 2 pawns are considerably stronger than rook and knight, and that 1 bishop is much better than 3 pawns. But it should be pointed out that 2 passed pawns on the 6th row, even if separated, will win against the bishop with or without the move, if neither can be taken at once, and the adverse king stands at least 3 clear squares distant from either pawn. On the other hand, a rook would easily stop such 2 or even more separated passed pawns, if they cannot be supported by their king for some time, by simply placing the rook on his 2nd or 1st row. The knight. Some of the old authorities maintained that this peculiar piece should not be brought out in any manner as to block one of the pawns, and therefore not at b3 before having advanced the respective bp2 squares. The king's gambit and the bishop's gambit are founded on that theory. But it is now universally acknowledged among experts that IPK4 on each side, 2KKT63 or 2QKT63 are excellent moves, and in most openings the defense ought also to bring out the 2 knights on their respective 3rd squares without minding the blockation of the pawn in front of them. After castling on the king's side, it is generally a good plan to remove the KKT in order to advance PKB4, and often KTKSQ is the best retreat for the purpose. But we disapprove on general principles of the plan sometimes adopted of playing PKR3 in order to retreat KTR2. The QKT is often maneuvered from QB3 via K2 to KKT3 for the attack, but he is also developed sometimes via Q2 to KBSQ, either before or after developing the QB and thence to KKT3 or K3 with good effect. When either knight can reach the adverse KB5 without being liable to be driven away or exchanged, he will occupy a very menacing position against the adverse king's side, which will greatly strengthen any attack in that quarter. The knights are well adapted for entering into a hole or a weak square of the adverse game, of which terms we shall give some further explanations anon, especially when supported by pawns on each side. A knight is only very slightly stronger in general than 3 pawns. Of its other relative valuations we have already spoken under the previous headings, but it is a peculiar feature of the knight that he will be generally stronger than the bishop in the ending when the opponent has a doubled pawn that cannot be dissolved, more especially when the one in front is of the opposite color of the bishop and is not protected by another pawn. Relative value of pieces and principles of play 6. For then the knight, by attacking that pawn, will at least keep the adverse king engaged for its protection, while his own king will be free for action. This ingenious maxim was chiefly brought into recognition by Herr Wiener. The pawn. The skillful management of the pawns which form a phalanx before the king and the other pieces is one of the most important items in the conduct of the game. Owing to the privilege of promotion to a queen, or any other piece chosen, which the pawns possess when reaching the 8th square, the loss of one of them is in the large majority of cases fatal among first-class masters. It is, moreover, now recognized among experts that not alone the weakness of one single pawn but also that of one single square into which any hostile man can be planted with commanding effect, will cause great trouble and often the loss of the game, and that by proper management of the pawns such points of vantage need not be opened for the opponent. The center pawns, namely the KP and QP, will have to be moved in the larger majority of openings sooner or later in order to free the pieces on each side, and they are not alone the best fitted for commencing operations, but we would lay it down as a rule that they are the only ones that ought to be moved in the early part of the game for various reasons. In the first place, as long as the 3 pawns on each wing remain unmoved, there is no weak square or a hole on the side which takes that precaution. The latter term, which is now generally accepted as a technical definition, was first used by the author in the International Chess Magazine of November 1886, where the disadvantage which it is intended to describe was also first pointed out, and it is most important for the learner fully to appreciate that disadvantage. The whole means a square on the third or fourth row in front of a pawn after the two adjoining pawns have been moved or captured. Thus, for instance, after the opening moves IPK4, 2PQB4, there are already two holes in white's camp, namely, one at Q and one at Q4. These holes will be all the more dangerous as long as the adverse QP remains at Q4, for that pawn stops the advance of two hostile ones, and by skillful play black will retain that advantage for a long time. If white's QP is afterward moved to Q3, that pawn will be weak, and even if he succeed in exchanging that pawn for another, the squares at Q3 and Q4 remain weak, and white will have to guard against the entrance of hostile men on those squares with one or more pieces, since both the pawns that previously could afford protection against such entrance are advanced. A hole or a weak square are still more troublesome when the opponent is enabled to open the file on which they are situated for his queens and rooks. In the opening or middle part, a hole or weak square are most dangerous in the center or on the king's side before queens are exchanged, but in the ending such weak points are generally more troublesome on the queen's side. In the next place, it is a great advantage for the ending to have as many pawns as possible and moved on their original squares. RITJS often most important to be able to gain a move by having the option of pushing upon one or two squares. Furthermore, we have already explained that three unmoved pawns on the king's side in conjunction with a minor piece form a strong bulwark against an attack on that wing, and we shall also show on some reasons against moving the pawns to the other wing. 3 Ivan Kiar's Handbook, page 44, gives the following good advice. It is generally advantageous for your pawns to occupy the middle of the board, because when there they greatly retard the movements of the opposing forces. The KP and the QP at their fourth squares are well posted, but it is not easy to maintain them in that position, and if you are driven to advance one of them, the power of both is much diminished. To this we would add that in general two pawns are stronger abreast than on a diagonal. The former command two black squares and two white ones in front, while in the latter situation, one of the squares is occupied by a pawn and all the points covered are only XL relative value of pieces and principles of play of one color. As a rule, it is unadvisable to advance any pawn beyond the fourth square, for the further a pawn is advanced into the hostile camp, the sooner he becomes liable to capture or inconvenient attack, especially in the end. At the utmost, a pawn may be sometimes advanced to the fifth square when he can be well supported on each side by so-called chains of pawns that cannot be broken up, but it is very rarely good play to advance a pawn to his sixth square. In the early part of the game, the formation of a center such as two pawns abreast at K4 and Q4 is a very desirable object, and in the gambits of the king's side the KBP is even sacrificed for that purpose. With the view of strengthening the center, it is usually better to capture with a P toward the middle rather than toward the wing, when the capture can be effected by two different pawns. When both sides have moved P, K4 and have also castled on the king's side, it will be often advantageous to allow the KBP to be doubled in order to form some attack on the open KKT file, or else with the object of afterward dissolving the doubled pawn by advancing PKB4. In like manner, the doubling of a pawn on the QB file may be useful in order to obtain command for the QR on the open QKT file and with the view of advancing P64. But an isolated doubled pawn, especially one on the rook's file, is mostly a great disadvantage. Most particular care should be taken that the opponent does not obtain the majority of pawns on the queen's side, on the wing opposite on which the kings of both parties usually castle. For a skillful player will generally manage to cut off the king from crossing to the other side, and the weaker pawns, thus deprived of the help of a powerful piece, will rarely be able to offer sufficient resistance to the opposite superiority of force. The majority of pawns on the king's side is rarely of much use, for the pawns of that wing cannot well advance without exposing their own king, and in the ending the hostile king is near at hand for stopping them. Each pawn has its own peculiarities which we shall endeavor to describe briefly. The two rook's pawns are the weakest, as each only commands one square, while the others command two. But each when advanced is only liable to be attacked by one pawn on the hostile knight's file, while the other pawns can be attacked by two hostile pawns, one on each side. When the opponent has first moved PKR3 after castling on king's side while you have not yet castled, you may also reply PKR with the view then of advancing soon PKKT4 and endeavoring to break through with the pawns on that wing. It is also good play to drive back a hostile piece by PKR3, but otherwise, especially when you have castled king's side, such an advance is not good, for it exposes that pawn to attack in many contingencies, and it also makes it inconvenient to advance the KBP, since a hole is then formed at KKT3. The KKTP if advanced to KKT3 leaves at once a hole at KR3 and at KB3, for it is assumed that the KP has already moved, or will have to move soon. If he advanced to KT4, supported by PKR3, he leaves additional holes at KB4 and KR4. It is advantageous to advance the KBP to B4 after castling when an adverse pawn is fixed at K4 by your own KP, which should be well defended. If your QP has been exchanged for the opposite KP, it is more often better to play PKB3 in support of your KP. If the KP has been exchanged on each side, it is rarely good to advance the KBP, for it leaves a weak square at K3 against which an attack of the hostile rook can also be directed. If the KBP remains unmoved, he will often give good support to the QB or KR at K3. The advance of the KP to the fifth square is specially objectionable, as the opponent will mostly gain opportunities, by PKB3, of opening an important file for his J-rook. Likewise, if the QP play to his fifth, the answer PQB3 will release the adverse queen and open a promising file for the hostile QR. Relative value of pieces and principles of play. When the QP has been exchanged, it is seldom right to advance PQB3. Likewise, when the QP is still at Q3, the advance of the QBP will leave the QP weak, and again, under other conditions, it retards the development of QKT63 with scarcely enough object in the opening. But still, PQB3 is often a good move later on. The advance of the QKTP naturally leaves holes at once at QR3 and at QB3, as P to Q4 or PQ3 are either supposed to be done already or sure to follow. Finally, the early pushing of the PQR3 can hardly do any good, but loses time and makes the subsequent advance of the QBP, which is sometimes good and necessary, objectionable on the ground that a hole will be created at QKT3. Thus it may be repeated in general that in most openings only the KP and QP should be maneuvered in conjunction with the rapid development of the minor pieces, and though the KBP and the QBP may also sometimes assist, it is at least useless and often compromising to move RP or KTP on either side in the early part of the game. A pawn attack may, however, often be formed with advantage when the opponent has crowded too many pieces on one wing, or when he has given an opportunity for effecting a promising breakthrough on either side by advancing one of his pawns. But as a rule, the fight in the center in conjunction with the two bishops' pawns will be sufficient, and at east the option of moving one or two squares ought to be reserved for the ending for the other pawns. There are other principles based on reasonings by analogies between different positions, as well as comparisons and combinations between different principles when they come in conflict with each other, but as explained in the preface, they are outside of the limits of this work, for they would require too laborious illustration. However, in our introductory comments on the games between Messrs. Steinitz and Chigarin, we give some instances of the application of principles in the opening with some explanations of their influence on later stages of the game.